Ordeals in NigerDelta. Beginning. In the heart of the oil-rich NigerDelta, where mangroves stretched their twisted arms into dark waters and the air smelled faintly of salt and crude oil, lived a little boy named Burrow. His father, Mr. Ebikabui, was the headmaster of the only primary school in their village, while his mother, Mama Ebi, was a small-scale trader, selling plantains and fish by the roadside. Despite the wealth buried beneath their feet, their lives were painted with the dull colors of poverty. Ebikaboye's salary barely covered their daily meals, and Mama Ebi's business was crippled by the rising cost of commodities. They lived in a fragile wooden house perched on the edges of the creek, their hopes floating like driftwood on troubled waters. Every evening, Burrow would sit by the water, watching the horizon glow red as oil spills gleamed under the fading sun. His father often spoke of the injustice of their lives, how a land blessed with abundant natural resources could still leave its people scraping for survival. "My son," he would say, staring into the distance, "this land is cursed not by God, but by the greed of men." But despite the struggles, they hoped for a better day. When their meager incomes could no longer sustain them, they turned to farming and fishing, hoping to at least feed their 5 sons from the fertile soil and bountiful waters of their homeland. Months passed, and their farm began to thrive. Crops pushed through the soil, and fishing nets returned heavy with life from the creek. But just when hope began to bloom in their hearts, disaster struck. An oil spill, thick and black like liquid death, spread across their farmlands and poisoned the water. The crops withered, and fish floated lifelessly on the oily surface. The family was devastated, but their cries for help fell on deaf ears. Government officials turned a blind eye, while their so-called representatives in power feasted on the wealth siphoned from their suffering land. It was during this period of hopelessness that cholera swept through their village. With no access to clean water or proper health care, Burrow's father succumbed to the disease. His frail body was laid to rest in the swampy soil, leaving Mama Ebi a widow with 5 children clinging to her for survival. Through tears and exhaustion, Mama Ebi picked up the shattered pieces of their lives. She washed clothes, hawked plantains she bought on credit, and endured the scorching sun just to see her sons through school. Years rolled by, and Burrow and his brothers grew into fine young men. They excelled in their studies, each one graduating with first-class honors in their respective fields. Tamaradi Anifa earned his degree in chemistry, while his eldest brother specialized in petroleum science. But despite their brilliance, job opportunities remained elusive. Doors to the multinational companies operating in their backyard were closed to them, while those same doors swung wide open for girlfriends, cousins, and relatives of corrupt politicians. Day after day, the brothers prayed. They were hard-working, faithful, and determined to make something of their lives despite the odds stacked against them. But life in the Niger Delta was cruel to those without godfathers. Mama Ebi, exhausted from years of endless labor, passed away just after the youngest son's graduation. Her frail body was laid next to her husband's in the swampy graveyard, and her sons were left to navigate the cruel world on their own. The injustice reached a breaking point when the eldest brother, who had begun investigating the misuse of scholarship funds meant for students like him, was accused of a crime he didn't commit. The case involved the children of powerful politicians, and with their influence, the boy was arrested, dragged through a mock trial, and executed in broad daylight. His brothers were left shattered, their lives stained with grief and injustice. Rumors swirled through the village, whispers of how the eldest brother had uncovered documents exposing how scholarships meant for brilliant students in the Niger Delta had been funneled to politicians' children and mistresses. The truth was buried with him, and his brothers were left to bear the weight of a broken legacy. But Burrow and his surviving brothers were not ready to give up. They carried their parents' dreams and their eldest brother's memory like a flame in the darkness. The people of the Niger Delta had suffered in silence for too long, and these young men, though broken, were determined to rise. Their story was no longer just about survival, it was about justice, about reclaiming what rightfully belonged to their people. The night after their eldest brother's execution, Tamaradi Anifa and his brothers sat in the darkness of their crumbling home. The flicker of a kerosene lamp cast long shadows on their weary faces. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant croaking of frogs from the swamp. Grief hung around them like a suffocating blanket, but beneath the sorrow burned a flicker of something else, rage. The weight of their father's unfulfilled dreams, their mother's sacrifices, and their brother's unjust death settled deep within their chests. Tamaradi Anifa clenched his fists as tears streamed down his face. "How long will we continue to suffer while they drink from golden cups filled with our sweat and tears?" he said, his voice trembling with anger. His brothers nodded, their faces etched with pain and determination. In that moment, a silent vow passed between them. They would no longer be silent victims of their circumstances. The greed and corruption that had stolen their family's joy would not have the final word. Days turned into weeks, and Tamaradi Anifa began investigating the same scholarship fraud that had cost his brother his life. He visited government offices, spoke to whistleblowers, and dug deep into the tangled web of corruption that had strangled their community for decades. What he found was worse than he had imagined: evidence of systemic looting, falsified records, and a carefully orchestrated scheme to keep the people of NigerDelta impoverished while politicians and their families thrived. But corruption had eyes and ears everywhere. Tamaradi Anifa started noticing shadowy figures following him, strange phone calls warning him to stop digging, and even threats left at their home. Fear began to creep into the hearts of his brothers. "Tamara, they will kill you like they killed our brother," his younger brother pleaded one night. But Tamaradi Anifa shook his head. "If we remain silent, then we've already died inside," he replied. One fateful evening, their home was set ablaze while they were still inside. The brothers barely escaped with their lives, coughing and stumbling through the thick smoke as the flames devoured their belongings. Everything their parents had left behind was gone in minutes. Photographs, keepsakes, their father's books, and their mother's cooking pots, all reduced to ash. They stood barefoot in the cold night, watching their home crumble. But their spirits remained unbroken. In the days that followed, the brothers became symbols of resistance in their community. They began to mobilize the youth, organizing peaceful protests and demanding accountability from their leaders. Social media became their weapon, and they used it to expose the injustices they had uncovered. Videos of their speeches went viral, and their voices began to reach beyond the creeks of the Niger Delta to the ears of people in distant cities. But the corrupt system fought back. Police raided their makeshift meeting spots, protesters were arrested, and false charges were filed against Tamaradi Anifa. At one point, he was detained for weeks without trial, kept in a dark cell with little food and water. Yet, even from behind bars, his voice could not be silenced. Letters he wrote from his cell found their way to social media, igniting even more outrage among the oppressed people of the Niger Delta. People began to rise. Mothers carried placards with pictures of their dead children who had died from preventable diseases. Young men and women flooded the streets, chanting for justice. Even international organizations began to take notice, and pressure mounted on the corrupt officials who had long bled the region dry. But every victory came with a price. Two of Tamaradi Anifa's brothers were ambushed one night while returning from a protest and were severely beaten. One of them never walked again. The fight was no longer just about justice, it was about survival. But Tamaradi Anifa refused to stop. In a final act of courage, Tamaradi Anifa managed to smuggle documents proving the extent of the corruption to a prominent investigative journalist. The documents contained names, account numbers, and evidence that would shake the very foundation of the corrupt political empire. But before the report could be published, Tamaradi Anifa disappeared. For weeks, his brothers searched for him. They knocked on doors, spoke to witnesses, and even confronted local authorities, but no one knew, or would admit to knowing, what had happened to him. Rumors swirled. Some said he had been killed and thrown into the river. Others claimed he was being held in a secret prison. The journalist published the evidence Tamaradi Anifa had risked his life to expose. The backlash was immediate. Protests erupted across the Niger Delta, and the government was forced to launch an official investigation. Several high-ranking politicians and oil executives were arrested, and stolen funds began trickling back into the community. Schools were built, clinics reopened, and clean water systems were installed in villages that had been without drinkable water for decades. But Tamarodi Anifa's fate remained unknown. His brothers carried on his legacy, dedicating their lives to ensuring that their community would never return to the shadows of poverty and neglect. They spoke his name at every rally, and his face became a symbol of hope and sacrifice. Years later, a monument was erected at the center of their village, a statue of Tamarodi Anifa holding a lantern, his face lifted towards the sky. Inscribed at the base were the words, asterisk, "He gave his light so we could see." Asterisk. The people of the Niger Delta never forgot his sacrifice. The land he fought for began to heal, and the waters once choked by oil spills ran clear again. The story of Tamarodi Anifa became a legend, a reminder